Okay, so today we are going to pick up where we left off with the diversity of animals. At this point, I doubt we'll have time to actually finish it, but that's okay. We'll be wrapping it up a little early to hand back the exams from last week. All right. So this should have been the last slide you guys saw, right? We just got done talking about gregarians, and we wrapped up with these really cool and also kind of scary man-of-war. So everything we've looked at up until this point, which is just the sponges and gregarians, these were all either diploblastic or had no true tissue layers. Everything we'll be looking at from this point on will all be triploblastic, meaning they have 3 germ layers during embryonic development. They will also all have bilateral symmetry. Although there's one sort of almost exception to that, and we'll deal with that when we get to it. Now, when we talk about bilateral symmetry, that's the type of symmetry we have, right? And that yields a very specific advantage. What is that advantage? Think about it for a second. What does bilateral symmetry allow an organism to have or do? Not walking necessarily. You're already getting too far ahead of it. Well, think about organisms that are radially symmetrical compared to organisms that are bilaterally symmetrical. What do those bilaterally symmetrical organisms have that none of the radially symmetrical organisms do? Somebody said, who said, head. Cephalization. This is the advantage you get. Oops, wrong direction. So when you're bilaterally symmetrical, that allows for the concentration of sensory organs and concentration of nerve cells at one end of the body, giving you the beginning of some form of head. This is advantageous because it allows you to sense your environment as it's coming at you as you move through it. So you put your eyes and ears up front, and then you can actually see and hear what's happening or smell and taste what's happening as you're moving through your environment. So the first phylum we're going to look at here that is bilaterally symmetrical and cephalized is Platyhelminthes. These are the flatworms. We watched that fun video of these guys and saw how incredibly cute they are with their tiny little dumb eyeballs and everything. There's about 20,000 species in this phylum. As I mentioned, everything we'll be looking at from this point has 3 germ layers. These guys are also acoelomane. So you guys remember what the coelom is? We talked about that last time. That's that body cavity that develops from the mesoderm and suspends organs. These guys don't have it. Now, of those 20,000 species in this phylum, most of them are parasitic, including some of the most well-known and iconic parasites. Can anyone take a guess of what one of those might be? Tapeworm, exactly. So tapeworms are members of the phylum Platyhelminthes. There are various species of tapeworm that can infect humans or other animals, depending on what we're talking about, and that's what they look like. You can see where the name flatworm comes from in that case. There are also free living species of flatworms, though. Those really cute planarians that we looked at, those guys are not parasitic, so you don't have to hate them. Now, when it comes to the physiology of these guys, most of them have what we call an incomplete digestive system. So an incomplete digestive system is two-way, and it only has one opening, meaning that things have to go out the same way they came in. There are some with a one-way digestive system, however, but most of them, it's two-way, incomplete. Now, one thing that's interesting in these organisms is the gut may be simple or it may also be highly branched. So if you look at this diagram here, you can see the gut of this flatworm branching and extending throughout the entire body. Why do you suppose they might have that?
Transpiration.
Yep. So they use this to aid in dispersal of nutrients throughout the body, because one thing they don't have is a circulatory system. That's why, for instance, we wouldn't need this really highly branched intestinal system extending throughout our body, because we have a circulatory system instead. These guys have extracellular digestion, as will all other species of animal that we look at. The only one we looked at that has intracellular digestion was... Nobody? The sponges. Remember, they have those choanocytes that actually engulf the food particles before they're digested and digest them inside the cell. So an interesting case here, there is a group of flatworms called the cestodes that have no digestive system. How do you suppose they get away with that? It's not even a simple two-way, one-opening incomplete system. They just don't have one. It has to do with where they live.
Do you live in the ocean, or?
They don't live in the ocean. The cestodes are internal parasites. Come on, brother. So these are internal parasites that live in the intestines of their host. So because they live inside the intestines, they're constantly being bathed in already digested food. So they don't even need a digestive system. They can just absorb nutrients from their host's digested food directly across their body wall. That's a really interesting evolutionary strategy. Yes?
So these parasites are usually always like ingested first, right, in order to actually get inside the actual body that they're...
Yeah, so parasites have a number of pathways through which they infect their host. One of the most common is eating either eggs or larvae.
How do they survive something like the stomach acid in order to emit themselves into...
So that's another evolutionary adaptation. They have actually evolved either egg casings or tissues that are tough enough that they will not be broken down by our digestive enzymes in the stomach until they get passed into the intestine. Make sure you don't eat cheap gas station sushi. So when it comes to excretion of waste in flatworms, these guys have an interesting system. They have this series of excretory canals that runs throughout their body. That's yellow in this diagram. And those canals open to the external environment through something called flame cells. And the waste, nitrogenous waste in particular, is excreted directly out through those pores formed by the flame cells. I guess I'm out of range here. Stay on this side.
So would that be a complete digestive tract?
No, so the excretory system is separate from the digestive system. So in humans, for instance, our digestive system includes everything from the mouth down to the esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and out to the rectum. Our excretory system is the kidneys, bladder, stuff like that. So the excretory system is used to filter wastes out of the blood and then get them out of the body. They have a very simple nervous system. They have a pair of nerve cords that run the length of the body, and they connect the body to a ganglion, which is, you can think of it as sort of a really primitive brain. This is just an area of really highly concentrated neurons, usually near the head of the animal in the case of cephalized organisms. They will generally also have some sort of concentration of sensory equipment up there, either photosensory, like eyes to sense light, or chemosensory, like a nose to smell, or some sort of tasting mechanism. Again, cephalization, big advantage. All right, any questions so far on these flatworms, other than the ones we've already had? Okay, great. So they have no circulatory or respiratory system, as I mentioned. So other than that branched intestinal system, how do you suppose they manage to circulate gases, exchange gases, circulate nutrients throughout their whole body? Because remember that every cell always has to be in constant state of exchange with its external environment. Diffusion, very good. So both gas and nutrient exchange depend on diffusion. And now we come to the explanation for why these guys are so flat. Because they have no respiratory system and they rely on diffusion for gas exchange, that means that each cell has to either be in direct contact with its external environment or in direct contact with the cell it is. So that necessitates these really flat body shapes so they can have that really high surface area to volume ratio. The thicker you get, the lower your surface area to volume ratio is, and the less efficiently you can exchange gases with your environment via diffusion. Now, most of these are monoecious. We talked about that as well in both plants and animals. Who remembers what that means?
Because they have both the female and male.
Yes, they produce both male and female reproductive structures. Another word for that is hermaphroditic. Asexual reproduction is also possible in these animals through fragmentation. If you take one of those planarians and you cut it in half, both halves will develop into a fully functioning, full-sized adult planarian. You can actually watch time-lapse videos of that on YouTube, and it's really interesting to watch. All right, on to the diversity here. So remember, there's 20,000 species, mostly parasitic. This phylum gets divided into 4 classes. The turbularians, the monogenea, the trematoda, and the cestoda, those creepy ones with no digestive system. So the turbularians, these are my favorite flatworms. They include those cool planarians. These include a lot of free living species. So this is the class that's not necessarily mostly parasitic. They are mostly marine, although there are some aquatic examples like those planarians. And there are even some that just live in really wet terrestrial environments. So these guys inhabit a pretty wide range of areas. That being my favorite example, obviously. And some of these species are capable of regeneration through a tiny fragment. So when it comes to fragmentation, the planarians are really, really good at it. Even if you only cut off a small piece, that will frequently develop into a whole new worm. Now the monogenea, these guys are a little bit smaller. Who can think back to the beginning of the semester when we were talking about microscopes and tell me what kind of microscope is used to make that image? It's an electron microscope. Do you remember what kind? And which one gives you depth of field? As the scanning electron microscope. We don't need to spend too much time on that. Anyway, these guys are external parasites, and they primarily parasitize fish. The life cycle includes a free-swimming larva that will then attach to some external structure of the fish, usually the gills, so they can access the blood. And from there, it will metamorphose into its adult form, which includes both a tail sucker and a mouth sucker. The tail sucker is where they attach. You have several different suckers and some anchors to really hold them on there. And then the mouth sucker is used for feeding. They will only have one host during their entire life cycle. They do not jump hosts. And in most cases, specific species of these monogeneans will only parasitize a specific species of fish. Now we have the trematodes. These guys are really creepy. These are also called flukes. These are internal parasites of a lot of different animals, including a lot of mollusks and in many cases humans as well. Some of the more dangerous foodborne parasites belong to this class. Anybody ever heard of pork tapeworm? You get it from undercooked pork chops. That one can actually kill you. That is a trematode fluke. So they have a very complex life cycle involving a primary host and one or sometimes multiple secondary hosts. So the primary host is where sexual reproduction takes place. They have to be living inside that organism in order to complete the sexual part of their life cycle. The secondary hosts are where asexual reproduction takes place. So funny fact about malaria is we're actually the secondary host to Plasmodium. Mosquitoes are the primary host. Kind of makes it feel less significant. Anyway, the primary host is usually a mollusk, even in many of the cases where these also infect humans. So sexual reproduction will occur in some either aquatic or marine snail, and the larvae may then swim through the water and like climb in through your skin around your ankles while you're harvesting rice in a rice field. and then they will go on to perform some asexual portion of their life cycle inside you. Some of these are really important and really devastating parasites in communities in Southeast Asia. Schistosomiasis is one of them. So that actually right there is Schistosoma. That's the species of trematode we're looking at. And finally, onto the cestodes, which we already briefly talked about. These are the tapeworms. They're internal parasites, mostly of vertebrates. I'm actually not personally aware of any example of a tapeworm affecting an invertebrate. And they live in the intestines of the host. This is why, remember, they don't need their own digestive system. Now they have, on one end, they have a sucker that they hold on with. That's called the scolex. You can basically think of it as the head, because this is sterilized. The rest of the body is made of a bunch of repeating segments called proglottids. Now these proglottids are kind of weird. They each contain the excretory system and complete reproductive structures, both male and female. And they're produced at the scolex and pushed towards the end as new proglottids are formed. So these things will get in, they'll latch onto the intestinal wall, and they'll just start growing more and more segments of their own body and sort of just pushing it on down the line like, I don't know, a sausage grinder pumping out these sausage links. And they can get to be very, very long in some cases, which is why they're potentially dangerous for people. Just having one small tapeworm in your intestine is not going to cause any negative health effects. But if you get a bunch of really big ones, like in this case, which is a 20-foot long tapeworm that was pulled out of a guy, in that case, they can cause intestinal blockage, and if that's not treated, it can end up being fatal. They used to sell these as weight loss products. Can you imagine that? Voluntarily infecting yourself with a tapeworm, trying to lose some weight? Yes?
So each of those proglottids contains their own excretory reproductive structures?
Yep.
So could they, in theory, like, you kind of like slice it up, but then it goes on to like grade its own
Yeah, these can reproduce through fragmentation. So that's why it's important to make sure you get the whole tapeworm out if you're removing them. All right. Well, before we move on to nematodes, any other questions on the platyhelminthes? Okay, you guys ready to move on to the nematodes? Exciting stuff. So the nematodes are the roundworms, in stark contrast to the flatworms. There are over 28,000 described species of nematode, and about 16,000 of them are parasitic. So a lot of these guys are also parasites. Interesting thing about nematodes is they're present in pretty much literally all habitats. I can't remember exactly who said it, but there was a biologist who once said that if the entire Earth were to suddenly disappear, it would still be visible as a thin film of nematodes. Because almost every surface on Earth is covered in nematodes. But they're usually not visible because they are microscopic in most cases, not all cases. As with everything else we're going to look at from here on out, they are triploblastic. These guys are pseudocoelomates. So this is different from the acoelomatic platyhelminthes, but also different from the eucoelomates, like, for instance, us. They have a cavity that does not arise from the mesoderm, so it is not a true coelom. These guys have a complete digestive system, one way, meaning it has two openings and things only travel in one direction. And they have a body that is encased in a really tough cuticle made of a substance called chitin. You can sort of think of this as a really tough but really flexible exoskeleton. They're a member of a group of animals called the ecdysozoans, whose uniting characteristic is the need to molt some sort of cuticle or exoskeleton. Their excretory system is not specialized. Instead, nitrogenous wastes are just removed via diffusion. They don't have anything really cool like a kidney like we do, to do it specifically. They contain 4 longitudinal nerve cords, meaning that runs the whole length of the body. And something really weird about these guys is they have a ganglion at the anterior end, the front, called the head ganglion. And they also have a ganglion at the posterior end, which is called the tail ganglion. So in a sense, they sort of have two brains. Although calling the ganglion a brain is a little bit of a reach. Another interesting thing is they only have longitudinal muscle, meaning their muscles only run the length of their body and can only contract in that direction. So these guys can only they can only move around by kind of whipping from side to side in wave-like undulating motions. They can't move like an earthworm. Everyone's seen an earthworm move, right? What does it do? Yeah, it sort of contracts longitudinally and then expands forward. These guys can't do that. They can only move like a whip. All right, that's all we're going to talk about for the nematodes. On to the arthropods. This one deserves special consideration because this is by far the largest phylum of animals or of any type of life in the world. So the name means jointed leg, arthro, joint, poda, foot or leg. And there are over 1 million described species in this phylum alone. So there are more arthropods than all other animals combined. There are more arthropods than all other animals and all plants and fungi combined. Quite a bit of these guys. They make up 3/4 of all described species, both living and extinct. Very, very successful phylum. Also triploblastic. These guys are eucoelomates. They have a true coelom. It's the first phylum we've looked at so far that does. And they have a hard exoskeleton made of chitin. So it's made out of the same biological material as those cuticles from the nematodes, but it is much harder and it is not flexible. This is important because they actually use this to provide structural support. So arthropods in general all have a segmented body. It's not just the legs, it's the body itself. Now the segmented body is usually fused into a few distinct segments. In many cases it has a head, an abdomen, and a thorax. That's what you usually think of when you think of an insect, right? So I have this little ant up here. You can see 3 distinct body segments: head, thorax, abdomen. In some cases though, it's fused into a cephalothorax and an abdomen, as is the case with spiders. I don't know if this drawing creeps anybody else out, but it sure creeps me out because I hate spiders. So the head and the thorax are fused into one segment, which is then called the cephalothorax, and then you have the abdomen in the back. So you see a few different forms in how these guys put their bodies together. Now they have something called an open circulatory system. What an open circulatory system means is there are no blood vessels. We have something called a closed circulatory system because all of our blood is contained within veins and arteries and capillaries, which allow it to be distributed more efficiently to every single part of the body. In the case of these guys, they just have this fluid bathing all of their organs that is called hemolymph. It's analogous to blood, but it is not true blood. And they have usually a couple of hearts that will sort of pump and stir up the hemolymph, and it flows throughout the body, and things are dispersed largely through diffusion. Now this is only possible in a relatively small body. The larger you get, the less you can rely on diffusion. The respiratory system of arthropods varies a little bit. So the more common arthropods, or at least the ones that we think of more commonly, the insects, these have a system of tracheae and spiracles. So those tracheae, individual, or I guess that is the individual, plural trachea. So that's just a system of tubes that actually run throughout the entire inside of the body. And they're open to the external environment through little pores called spiracles. So gas exchange happens via diffusion in this internal system of tubes. In the case of aquatic crustaceans, they use gills, very similar respiratory organ to a fish. Arachnids, spiders, they have something weird called book lungs, where they have really thin lungs that are sandwiched in between layers of space to allow for efficient gas exchange. And then even more confusing, the aquatic chelicerates, of which that horseshoe crab is an example, they use something called book gills. which are relatively similar in arrangement to the spider's big lungs, except obviously they are gills and not lungs. So you see a fairly diverse range of respiratory systems in this phylum, which is not necessarily surprising considering that there's over 1 million species. Hey, I just said that. So these guys are everywhere. They've colonized the land, air, and sea all over the world. And for the purpose of classification, because there's so many of them, we don't even go directly into class, we go into subphylum. So the 5 subphyla are the Trilobitomorpha, it's a mouthful, the Hexapoda, the Myriapoda, the Crustacea, and the Chelicerata. Each one of these is about to get its own slide, so don't worry if I'm moving too fast for you at this point. So the Trilobitomorpha, that's the guy we had in the first slide on arthropods. These guys are extinct. There are no living members of this subphylum known to science. When they were around, though, they were entirely marine species. Anybody ever heard of trilobites? Some of you, most of you, great. Everyone who did the reading before class? These guys were pretty successful while they were around, and they managed to stick around for over 300 million years. So these guys were basically alive through most of the time of the dinosaurs. But they're gone now. Now onto the Hexapoda. This is the largest subphylum within the arthropods, and they have 6 legs. It's right there in the name. If everybody remembers their Latin, hex, 6, poda, legs. Body segments, as we already mentioned, are fused into head, thorax, and abdomen. That's pretty uniform throughout this subphylum. Anybody want to guess how many species there are in this one? It's most of the arthropods, which have over 1 million. These have over 800,000 species. So even this subphylum has more species than any other phylum. And it includes all of the common insects that we think of. So things like ants, bees, cockroaches. There you have a bee in the diagram, which has a very similar body plan to that ant with those 3 distinct segments. Now, who's heard of the Myriapoda before? We're getting into that one next. These guys. So their name basically means lots of legs. And as it turns out, members of this subphylum have anywhere from 10 to about 750 legs per individual. This include has 13,000 species, and the common examples that people would have heard of are the centipedes and the millipedes. Centipedes are really creepy, millipedes are actually kind of cute. Anybody know the difference? What? The amount of legs, can you get more specific? It's the amount of legs per body segment. So centipedes only have 1 pair of legs per segment, millipedes have 2. And they also look way less like they're going to try to kill you.
Was that a silverfish? Silverfish?
That probably is a silverfish. I actually don't know offhand, but it looks kind of like one. Anyway, crustaceans, like that cool lobster. These are the dominant aquatic arthropod. They are not the only aquatic arthropod, but they are the dominant one. There are also a few terrestrial species of crustaceans. Anybody here played with pill bugs, or sow bugs they're often called? Those little gray things, you touch them and they roll into a ball. Those are actually a reasonably close relative of lobsters. They are the crustaceans. There's also huge marine ones that look like a 12-inch long pill bug, and they're pretty crazy. Anyway, about 47,000 species in this subphylum, so this is also quite diverse. And it includes a lot of the stuff that we like to eat from the ocean, like shrimp, crabs, and lobsters. Just talking about these guys makes me hungry. An interesting characteristic that's relatively unique to the crustaceans within the arthropods is in addition to their chitinous exoskeleton, a lot of these guys will also infuse calcium carbonate into their exoskeleton. Where else do we see calcium carbonate? Bones. Where else outside humans or outside vertebrates? Clamshells is a big one, or coral reefs. So calcium carbonate is a very hard chemical. Therefore, by infusing their exoskeletons with calcium carbonate, some of these guys can become very well protected against any sort of mechanical stress. And then finally onto the Chelicerata, which is probably a new word for you guys, but I'm sure you're familiar with its members. So there are about 103,000 species here, also quite diverse. The majority of them are terrestrial, but there are a few aquatic or marine chelicerates. The terrestrial ones include things like spiders and scorpions, stuff that most people don't really like. The marine species include horseshoe crabs and sea spiders. So the group is named for the chelicerae. That's the uniting characteristic here. And who read far enough ahead to know what chelicerae are? Everybody, great. So they are specialized mouth parts that are generally used for feeding, but in special cases, i.e. the spiders, they can be used for something else. Anybody want to guess what that is? So in some spiders, the chelicerae have been modified to inject venom into their prey. Yeah, fun stuff. Any questions on the arthropods before we move on to our next phylum? All right then. So then moving on to the mollusks. About 85,000 species here. Essentially all of them are marine, meaning they basically all live in the ocean. And they are triploblastic eucoelomates, like us. Now the interesting thing about this phylum is they take on a very wide variety of body plans. So most of the other phyla we've been looking at, most of the members generally look like each other. Like all the flatworms all look like flat worms. All the arthropods all have these jointed legs and they all have generally the same body segments, although some of them may be fused. In the case of mollusks, this includes everything from tiny little snails to huge octopuses or gigantic squids. These are all mollusks and they have very different body plans. In between those, there's a lot of different body plans. But they all have the same basic structures, even though those structures may be modified, enhanced, or reduced in certain species. So they all have a ventral muscular foot. Doesn't look like your foot, but it's at the bottom of the animal in most places. They all have a visceral mass, which is basically their body, containing the organs. And they all have a dorsal mantle. In the case of snails, that mantle is just under the shell and is actually the tissue responsible for secreting the shell. In the case of something like an octopus, it looks quite different. Now they may or may not have a shell. Not all of the members of this phylum do. Some of them have two shells. The foot, like everything else, can vary pretty greatly in both shape and function within this phylum. And the coelom in this case is a very reduced structure in the adult individuals. So unlike most coelomates where the coelom takes up a lot of the inner portion of the body, in the case of mollusks, the coelom is reduced to this small cavity surrounding the heart. So most of the organs are not encased within that coelom as they would be in animals like, for instance, us. Instead, they have another cavity called the mantle cavity, which forms entirely independently of the coelom and houses many of the other organs. Most mollusks have an open circulatory system. Who remembers what that means? Just talked about it.
There's two kinds.
That's, you're talking about digestive system now. Circulatory system. No blood vessels. That's what an open circulatory system means. However, there are exceptions within this phylum, notably the octopuses and squids. They have a closed circulatory system like we do. Now, I've been crowing about the incredible diversity of shapes and body plans in this phylum. It's divided into 7 classes, and the 7 classes tend to look very different from each other. So first you have the Aplacophora, then the Monoplacophora, and again, each of these will get its own slide. The Polyplacophora, Bivalvia, Gastropoda, Cephalopoda, and then some weird little guy. Oh, I'm missing Scaphopoda on that list. So there should be another one below Cephalopoda, and it's the Scaphopoda. But it does have its own slide, so you'll see it in a moment. Anyway, the Aplacophora, these guys are relatively simple. Their name literally translates into bearing no plates. And they have that name because they have no shell. These guys are relatively tiny marine worms. And they mostly live in the deep sea on the seafloor. Relatively simple organisms, looking nothing like anything else in this phylum. Now the Monoplacophora. If Aplacophora means bearing no plates, what do you suppose this one means? Yeah, bearing one plate. So these guys have a single, almost cap-like shell that covers their body from above. And for a long time, we actually thought these were extinct. We only knew of them through the fossil records. In 1952, they discovered some living specimens, though. And now we have almost 24 described living species within this subphylum. Now next, on to the Polyplacophora. Hopefully you guys are noticing a pattern here, bearing many plates. So these guys have an armor-like 8-plated shell. These are some really cool, often intertidal marine species. If you go to the tide pools down in Newport, for instance, you can find a lot of these guys. These are called chitons. We don't have the brightly colored ones in Newport, but there's still a bunch of them, and they're still cool to look at. So you notice the shell on the back has 8 plates that are hinged, sort of like a suit of armor. Come on, reach. All right. So they have this incredibly large foot, which is used for attaching them very firmly to rocks. Because if you live in the intertidal zone, you have to deal with a lot of wave energy. And at low tide, when you're exposed to the air, you may have to deal with animals trying to pick you off of the rocks and eat you. So it becomes very advantageous to be able to hold on real tight to that rock. The mantle extends beyond the shell to form sort of a girdle. So this brightly colored pink and yellow segment is actually not shell, that is mantle. All right, I mentioned some of these mollusks will have 2 shells, and that's the bivalves. These guys are enclosed in a pair of hinged shells. They feed by filtering food particles out of the water, and they include a lot of easily recognizable species like clams, oysters, mussels, and scallops. How many of you guys knew that these were close relatives of octopuses? Yeah, it's not something you think of every day. All right, so then on to the Gastropoda. This is one of my favorite groups within the mollusk phylum. The name translates roughly into stomach foot. These are the guys that really tend to walk around on that large, muscular ventral foot that is characteristic of this phylum. They may or may not have a shell. This includes snails and slugs. So the snails obviously do have a shell, the slugs do not. This is the only class of mollusks that includes any terrestrial species. Everything else lives in water, usually the ocean. Also includes things like sea hares and sea butterflies. One of my favorite marine organisms, or groups of marine organisms, is the nudibranchs. These are generally in the range of 1/2 inch to maybe 1.5 inches long, really tiny, brightly colored sea snail or sea slugs that are really cool to look at, and we do have those here in California as well. How are we doing on time? Oh geez, we're about out of time. I'm going to go through the next 2 slides, and then I'll hand out the exams. So the cephalopods. This one translates into head foot. Now in this class, you have a shell that may be quite prominent, as is the case with the nautiluses, or it may be extremely reduced, sometimes housed entirely internally like it is in squids and cuttlefish. They have a very well-developed and very complex nervous system. In fact, cephalopods, more specifically octopuses, are the most intelligent of all invertebrate animals. They're actually more intelligent than a lot of vertebrates. There's been a lot of cool research into this. Interesting examples of their intelligence is octopuses can recognize individual researchers in the lab, and they have people that they like and don't like, and they will hold grudges. And they will sometimes use their water jets to squirt water on people they don't like as they walk past the tanks. There's also been documented cases of octopuses using their water jets to basically shoot out the lights in the lab if they want it to be dark. They'll actually squirt water in the light, short circuit the bulb, and turn it off. It's very interesting stuff. Another really cool thing about this class is they're generally tend to be very vividly colored, and they can also change their colors quite rapidly and at will. I don't have time for this, but I really want you guys to see it. So we're gonna watch like a 1-minute YouTube video.
But if it's morbid shape, in an instant, to appear as seemingly any animal around it. At first, no one had any idea what it was.
The first time I saw it, I just was blown away. You couldn't get a more spectacular animal. It really is the pinnacle of wizardry.
Biologist Mark Norman was the first scientist to study this seemingly shapeless creature. He named it the mimic octopus.
The mimic octopus makes itself look like a living, moving animal, so it pulls all its arms around behind its body and swims along like a poisonous flatfish or a banded sole. In other cases, if it's getting attacked, it puts 6 arms down a hole and raises the other 2 arms to look like a poisonous sea snake that has bands along its body. That's not enough. It will swim along looking like a poisonous lionfish with these banded arms looking like the banded spines that come off these very deadly fish.
So far, 15 separate species are known to be in the mimic octopus act, and Norman is not always sure exactly what the mimic is doing. He observed this mimic scuttling along the sea bottom, looking something like a furry turkey with human legs.
Sometimes it's hard when you watch the mimic octopus doing what it does to interpret what's going on. It's a bit like looking at ink spots in a psychiatrist's office going, I don't know what it is, it could be a piano, it could be a fridge. So you get 3 or 4 divers together and you'll argue all night trying to work out what we think it was mimicking.
Where did nature's greatest actor come from?
How cool is that stuff? All right, one more slide, and then I'll pass out the exams during office hours, which start directly after classes. So this is the final class within the models, the Scaphopoda. The name translates into boat feet. I have no idea where they got that one. But they're also called tusk shells or tooth shells, which seems a lot more appropriate to me. These are very small organisms, and the shell has an opening at both ends. So these are empty scaphoid shells. This is a microscopic image of a very small living scaphoid. Here you see that muscular foot coming out the large end, and then you have a really reduced head that sticks out the hole in this pointy other end. So again, a very different form than anything else you see within this phylum. And I've already gone over by 2 minutes, so that's all we're going to do today. Office hours start right here, right now, and I will use them to hand out exams. So these exam grades are not yet posted to Canvas, but I do have them saved in a spreadsheet, so don't worry about that. The average came out to a 60, so I put a 10-point curve on it to bring the average up to a C. As always, please double check my math and adding up your points. And please double check that you don't think I made any unfair deductions or anything wrong that should have been right. doing it correctly. Yeah, I'm gonna go.
Yeah, I think I did when I did. Oh, yeah, and it said it was like a workshop.
Okay, but like if you check the original bar, just says don't forget, there's nothing else.
Yeah. It's there to,
If you look, you'll find that it's an adult workshop.
it's there to grab attention.
Maybe. They just concerned me.
It worked for them.
They don't have to try and I'm interested in everything.
Oh, and
Hi, you want to volunteer for this? Okay. I'm bad at saying no, it's a problem.
You're bad at saying no.
Like, if the time calls for it.
Thank you for letting me know that information. I may or may not use that.